this the feast of the Holy Trinity. I often like to think, and probably have told you a few times before, the interpretation of the Holy Trinity given to us by Dorothy Sayers, not in her Lord Peter Wimsey novels, but rather in one of her theological essays. And she takes the image of an artist and the art and our reaction to the art. And I can't remember whether she talks about a painting or a sculpture. It doesn't really matter. I prefer to use the idea of a sculpture. So, it goes something like this. God the Father, who is unknowable, beyond our possibility of understanding, immense, grand, glorious, chooses to become human so that we can relate in some way to God. Chooses to become human so that we can touch and speak to and listen to. In the same way, an artist sees before him a piece of stone and has an idea, which is probably grand and glorious and can't be known unless the stone is carved to make that which the sculptor has in his or her head transferred to the stone with the work of chisels and so on. And then, when Jesus walked this earth, and in the years since then, we, the followers of Jesus, have wanted to know who Jesus is. And so, we have some kind of an encounter with Jesus. Nicodemus had an encounter with Jesus, and when he had that encounter with Jesus, he was somewhat perturbed and confused. There were those who had encounters with Jesus who turned away. Pilate had an encounter with Jesus and washed his hands of the whole matter. The disciples had an encounter with Jesus and followed him with all that they had to the rest of their days. So there's a variety of reactions to an encounter with Jesus as we have today. And some of us, in encountering Jesus, can't turn away. And some take no interest. In like manner, when you look at a carving, at a sculpture, something happens to you as you view that sculpture. There's an interaction. You don't like it, you turn away from it, or you need to be near it. You need to touch it and see it and know what it is. And so there is that parallel. And over the years, many people have struggled with the concept of the Trinity, trying to figure out, let me see now, the Father and the Son. How does that work anyway? And the Spirit, how could you be three different? But rather, it's one, conveyed to us in human form, with whom we interact by the power of the Spirit. As I said to the children a few moments ago, last week we had the day of Pentecost, and we thought about the Spirit of God coming. And the Spirit of God came and enlivened the disciples so that they found themselves expressing with great joy the wonders and glories of who God is. The Spirit of God was moving in them. We read in Isaiah chapter 6, one of my favorite passages today. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of the Lord filled the temple, and the seraphim called one to another, Holy, holy, holy. And the thresholds and the pillars of the temple shook when they cried. And smoke filled the temple. When you see stone grinding upon stone, there's a rock dust that fills the air like smoke. And I imagine that was the smoke. It might have been incense, but I like to imagine it was the voice of the seraphim in the temple crying, Holy, and the whole thing shaking and puffs of rock dust filling the air at the might and majesty of this immense scene. And Isaiah falls flat on his face. Woe is me, he cries. I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell amongst the people of unclean lips. And I have seen the Most High, the Almighty. Well, fortunately for Isaiah, there was a remedy. And one of the seraphim, or seraphs as in our translation today, went to the altar and brought burning coals and came and purged his lips. We imagine this to be a vision of some sort. We don't know that Isaiah ended up having his lips scorched off. And once his lips had been touched with the live coal from the altar, he could stand in the presence of God and speak to God. Here am I, send me. There was a lot of fear from time to time, we read in the Scriptures, by those who encountered the living God or any manifestation of the living God. How often, as you read through the Old Testament, do you find some character saying, "Oh, I've seen an angel," or "I've seen God, I'm surely going to die"? They think it's all over because they cannot be in the presence of one so mighty, so wonderful, so powerful, and still exist. Like noonday sun in the heat of summer on a shallow pool of water goes. Like a tender young plant experiencing the scorching sun, it wilts and is gone. Like the dross in a blast furnace, burnt away, leaving gold or silver or some other precious thing. Those are the images we have in the Bible of what happens when we come into the presence of the living God. However, I don't know of any instance in the Bible where anyone was struck dead by being in the presence of the living God, because the living God is gracious. Think of Moses in the wilderness, tending the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. He comes across a burning bush and turns aside to see this sight, to see what is it. And a voice comes from the bush and says to Moses, "Take off your shoes, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." Moses has something to do which makes him holy enough to be in the presence of God. Isaiah had something done to him which made him holy enough to stand in the presence of God. And in like manner, as you go through the Scriptures and look at those who encountered God, you found that God provided the remedy. Look at Saul of Tarsus, breathing threats of fire and death as he went from Jerusalem to Damascus with letters to arrest the Christians and throw them into prison and have them put to death. On that journey, Saul is met by the risen Christ, who says to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And then Jesus says to Saul, after he's been blinded by this encounter, "I want you to go to Damascus, to a house on Straight Street, and speak to Simon, and he will pray for you and you will be healed." Jesus gave him something to do that he might be restored and able to stand in the presence of the living God. The disciples, touched by the Spirit, not just on the day of Pentecost, but every time they met Jesus, when he spoke as one with authority, when he was the one who said the words, "Come, follow me," the Spirit of God, tugging at their heartstrings, brought them to the place where they could follow Jesus. They took the step that he asked them to take, and they were able to stand in the presence of the living God. We today come before the living God. In our worship, we offer ourselves afresh to the manifestation of God made known to us in Jesus Christ. And it is the Spirit of God that pulls at our heartstrings and calls us to worship. It is the Spirit of God that enables us to see through the created being, the manifested humanity of Jesus, into the very heart and mind of God. And somehow, when we look at Jesus, we get a glimpse of the wonder and of the glory that is the Godhead. Jesus came to make known to us the Father. The Spirit enlivens our hearts to make known to us the Son. By the Spirit we know the Son, and through the Son the Father. And when we get that close, we get a touch of that same paralysis that Isaiah had. Woe is me, I am undone. I am a person of unclean lips, and I live amongst the people of unclean lips. I've been touched. I've seen the presence of the Holy One. We structure our worship in the church so that it's easier for us to find ourselves in that place. We sing hymns as we did today, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Heaven and earth, we all come before God. We structure our services with hymns and psalms and scriptures and prayers, with a blessed sacrament of the body and blood of Christ. That we might, in those moments, somehow, some way, touch the presence of the living God. Remember the woman that was in that great throng as Jesus was going to the house of Jairus to heal Jairus' daughter who had been ill. And the woman in the throng, who had been ill for 12 years, said, if only I could touch the hem of his garment, I shall be healed. And she did. She reached out in the crowd and touched his garment. And Luke tells us, power went out from Jesus and healed her. And Jesus turned around and said, who touched me? Oh, this is a crowd jostling as Jesus was on his way to Jairus' house. And the disciples said, Lord, how can you say, who touched me? Come on, like there's a crowd here. Who touched you? Like everybody touched you. And he turned around and he looked at the woman and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you whole. She knew that if only she could touch the hem of his garment. As we come together to worship, it's my prayer that each of us find an opportunity to touch the hem of God's garment. You don't have to expect that every second of every worship service will fill you with all the wonder and glory and presence of God, and that the whole thing is... But if there's a moment, if there's a second, if there's an instant when you feel like you've touched the hem of the garment of God, that instant where you can feel the wind of the Spirit blowing through you, the power of God flowing out from Jesus to touch you, then you've made a connection. And what will the connection do for you? I believe the connection will do for you and for me, for each of us, the same as it did for Moses when he took the shoes off his feet, that it did for Isaiah when the burning coal touched his lips. It will enable us to stand in the presence of God and hear God's call for us. The reading from Isaiah chapter 6 today in verse 8 ended with Isaiah saying, here am I, send me. If you read on beyond that in the rest of the chapter, you find out what he's sent to do. In Exodus chapter 3, when we see Moses meeting God in the burning bush, he finally, after a long conversation, agrees to do what God called him to do. Saul, as he was then known, on the road to Damascus, encountering Jesus, was ready to go and do what Jesus wanted him to do. As we come into the presence of God in this holy place, as we look again upon the face of Jesus as enabled by the Spirit working in us, part of that reaching out to touch, part of that desiring to come in close contact with God, is a willingness to hear the voice of God say to us what God seeks us to do. May God, who is rich in mercy and abundant in grace, give to each of us that moment when we hear God's call and the courage to respond. Amen.